On Saturday, April 25, 2024, a bomb exploded on the Pan-American Highway in Colombia's Cauca department, tearing through multiple vehicles and leaving at least 21 people dead. Over 50 others were injured. While this was the most visible among a string of recent attacks, given the choice of weapon and the death toll, it was far from the only one. This was just one of 26 attacks that weekend alone across the departments of Cauca and Valle del Cauca. Some of the other attacks that weekend included drone strikes targeting civilians, a targeted strike against a police station using explosives and rifles, and an attack against a military battalion in Palmyra, where insurgents used gas cylinders rigged with explosives to cause massive damage. Remarkably, all these attacks were carried out by a single armed group in a country grappling with dozens of them. Just 2 months before the Cauca attacks, President Gustavo Petro survived an attempted assassination, following months of warnings that drug traffickers were targeting him. Other political figures haven't been as fortunate. Senator Miguel Uribe, a presidential hopeful, was assassinated in June 2023. Additionally, 2 presidential staffers were killed in May 2024. This grim national backdrop set the stage for the Colombian people as they headed to the polls on May 31, 2024 for the first round of presidential elections. By then, Colombia's situation had deteriorated so severely that the Red Cross issued a stark warning. The country was facing its worst humanitarian crisis in a decade. Amidst this deepening crisis, Colombia's presidential election became, above all else, a referendum on security. The 2 candidates who advanced to the runoff presented diametrically opposed visions for resolving the issue. As the nation grapples with escalating violence, a critical choice looms. Will Colombia embrace a path of total war or pursue a controversial total peace? One of those candidates, a controversial figure with a dark past, is advocating for nothing less than total war. Born in 1978, Abelardo de la Espriella, son of a magistrate who twice failed to become the governor of Córdoba, is, to put it mildly, a highly controversial presidential candidate. This is a man who once confessed on national television to tying cats to firecrackers as a child to watch them explode. He also has close ties to Salvatore Mancuso, who was sentenced to 40 years in prison for crimes too heinous to be explicitly detailed here on YouTube. Mancuso was a prominent leader within the notorious paramilitary group, the AUC, and his ties to Mr. de la Espriella appear to run deep. A lawyer by profession, de la Espriella gained notoriety in the early 2000s by defending paramilitary leaders who had plunged Colombia into chaos. He later defended politicians accused of allying with and protecting the AUC, a group with murky links to the Colombian armed forces. De la Espriella's former clients included Eleonora Pineda, D.B. Malouf, and Rocio Arias, all 3 convicted in one of the biggest scandals in Colombian history. That scandal implicated over 250 politicians for colluding with the UC in a bid to secure their power. De la Espriella's most controversial client, however, isn't even Colombian. Alex Saab, a Venezuelan former minister who was extremely close to the now-captured president Nicolás Maduro. Like Maduro, Saab is currently a guest of the American criminal justice system, on trial for his alleged role in a sprawling international money laundering conspiracy. Despite these deep ties to the darker side of Latin American politics, de la Espriella has undergone a political transformation, recasting himself as a tough on-crime figure. Colombia's only hope to quell the nation's chaos. He has adopted the nickname the Tiger, which, according to him, represents his character and willingness to fight for the Colombian people. While this is his preferred nickname, observers have dubbed him Colombia's version of El Salvador's Nayib Bukele. He even bears a striking resemblance to Bukele, an observation that appears to be quite intentional. Nayib Bukele is, of course, the Salvadoran president whose policies have dramatically reduced his country's homicide rate from 53.1 murders per 100,000 people in 2018 to just 1.9 per 100,000 in 2024. Given Colombia's internal security crisis, and the fact that a candidate could point to Bukele-style policies as a potential solution, it's easy to see why de la Espriella would want to emulate his look, sound, and promises. But Bukele achieved such a dramatic decrease in homicides in El Salvador through 2 key strategies. First, within days of taking office, he launched the Territorial Control Plan, which significantly increased military presence in areas with the highest gang activity. Their primary goal, beyond arresting criminals, was to dismantle extortion rackets, a major source of gang financing. Simultaneously, Bukele's administration declared a temporary state of emergency in the country's penitentiary system, placing 28 prisons under complete lockdown. This was all done to prevent incarcerated gang leaders from communicating with their affiliates and coordinating violent attacks. This laid the groundwork. Then in March 2022, following a massive spike in homicides that saw 87 people killed in a single weekend, El Salvador's government declared a state of exception, suspending constitutional rights and granting unrestricted powers to security forces. Over 0 people have been arrested since the state of exception was instituted. To house the overflow, the government constructed a terrorism confinement center, better known as SICO, a 40,000-person mega prison now considered the largest in the world. SICO prisoners do not receive visits and are never allowed outdoors. The prison offers no rehabilitative programs to prepare inmates for a return to civilian life at the end of their sentences because, according to Bukele's Minister of Justice, those at SICO would never return to their communities. De la Espriella aims to replicate this system in Colombia. Among his many proposals, De la Espriella plans to build 10 mega-prisons directly modeled on SICO, where inmates would be held, in his own words, 10 stories underground, living on bread and water. He has pledged to strengthen the country's armed forces with drones and artificial intelligence, launch a nationwide military offensive to reassert state control within 90 days, resume airstrikes on jungle narco camps, and conduct aerial fumigation of coca crops while replacing them with cacao and African palm to help farmers transition away from illicit activities. He has also pledged to deploy the National Army into Colombian cities to reclaim urban territory currently controlled by criminal gangs. In doing so, he would transfer functions traditionally belonging to the Colombian police directly to the military. De la Espriella has suggested he would authorize police to shoot protesters deemed violent. He has also raised the prospect of easing restrictions on civilians carrying firearms under certain conditions. But perhaps most importantly, he has dismissed any hopes of a peace process with Colombia's paramilitaries and organized criminal networks. Instead, he told the Associated Press that he would unleash God's wrath upon narco-terrorists and anyone he declared a military target, eliminating them like cockroaches and rats. This aggressive rhetoric is clearly resonating with Colombian voters. De la Espriella came first in the initial round of presidential voting with 74% of the overall vote share. This defied polls that had placed his rival, leftist Senator Ivan Cepeda, ahead. He defeated Cepeda in 16 of the country's 32 departments, primarily in the interior and along the border with Venezuela. However, he was less successful along the coast, where Colombia's current government has heavily invested in development projects over the past 4 years. Laura Bonilla, deputy director at the Peace and Reconciliation Foundation, PAIRS, told Al Jazeera that this outcome reflected differing priorities. People in central areas and near the capital prioritize security, while those along the coast are more interested in the socio-economic issues, championed by leftist candidate Cepeda. Still, De la Espriella's victory in the first round reflects widespread rejection of Gustavo Petro's current government. During his tenure, Petro's administration was widely seen as having allowed gangs to accumulate wealth and build strength, as the leadership mishandled a national amnesty plan. For many voters, De la Espriella represents the complete opposite of Petro. He is a Bukele-like figure whose policies, while controversial to a Western audience, are what many Colombian citizens feel they need to save their nation from the grip of violence. Local businesswoman Belén Lopera said it best in an interview with NPR, stating, "We need a Bukele so that things can change here in Colombia. Winning public support is one thing, especially during campaign season, when presidential hopefuls can say anything they like before their policies are put to the test. But successfully implementing these policies is a whole different matter." This raises an interesting question. Can De la Espriella's total war strategy actually succeed in Colombia? To determine whether De la Espriella's total war strategy will work, we need to understand the factors that made Bukele's model so effective. Factors De la Espriella won't be able to rely upon. First, El Salvador is a relatively small country, covering about 21,000 square kilometers with a population of approximately 6 million. For comparison, Colombia spans about 1 million square kilometers, making it roughly 50 times larger than El Salvador, with a population of about 54 million, approximately 9 times El Salvador's population. Second, The violence plaguing El Salvador largely stemmed from two main groups, MS-13 and Barrio 18. Unlike cartels in Mexico or Colombia, these gangs were never major players in the international drug trade. Instead, they primarily generated income through local extortion, shaking down bus drivers, market vendors, and small businesses, mostly within the neighborhoods they controlled. Third, as Riza Grace Targo, a Latin America expert at Eurasia Group, pointed out, many gang members had distinctive facial tattoos, making them extremely easy to identify. Colombia, by contrast, deals with a much wider array of paramilitaries and organized criminal groups, most of which are far more ambitious and adept at blending in with the civilian population. Less acknowledged in El Salvador, but equally important, was the role of Bukele's secret pact with the gangs. El Faro, a leading investigative outlet, uncovered a secret deal negotiated between gang leaders and two Bukele officials, Director of Prisons Osiris Luna and Carlos Marroquin, head of the Social Fabric Reconstruction Unit, in exchange for control over concession sales inside the jails and the promise of social and economic programs both inside and outside the prisons. Gang leaders promised to keep violence rates low. This pact led the gangs to believe Bukele's crackdowns would be temporary and somewhat limited. Initially, they were proven correct. However, in April 2020 and November 2021, the gangs violated the deal's terms, embarking on sudden killing sprees. In both instances, Bukele vowed vengeance, published pictures of the perpetrators, and ordered the military to use lethal force. Yet, the crackdowns were as brief as the attacks that spurred them. The gangs didn't retaliate, and the government returned to the negotiating table within days. Thus, Bukele was able to manufacture a false sense of security. So, in March 2022, when the gangs embarked on another killing spree, they had little reason to believe there would be any deviation from the established pattern. When the government responded in the usual way with crackdowns and arrests, the gangs did not fight back, believing the crackdown would subside as previous ones had. This gave the government a critical window to decimate the gangs. By the time they realized what had happened, it was already too late. Bukele had already declared his state of exception, making it abundantly clear he was not returning to the negotiating table. Bukele was dealing with a small territory and population, attempting to quell just two main armed groups with narrow priorities and easily identifiable members, and a government that already had a deal making the gangs complacent. None of these circumstances will be easy to replicate elsewhere, let alone in a nation as complex as Colombia. But don't just take our word for it, consider what happened in Ecuador. When President Daniel Noboa took office in late 2023, he adopted Bukele's iron fist approach, declaring an internal armed conflict, deploying the military, and proposing Zika-style mega-prisons. For a while, that strategy appeared to work, until it didn't. Following a 14% drop in intentional homicides between 2023 and 2024, Ecuador's homicide rate is projected to reach 59 per 100,000 in 2025. Observers attributed Noboa's failure to gang fragmentation. When Noboa's forces arrested or killed the leaders of Ecuador's criminal organizations, they did not neutralize those groups. Instead, they shattered formerly unified syndicates into competing factions, each fighting the others for drug trafficking routes and illegal mining territories. This is what happens when the underlying economy sustaining the gangs is robust enough to continuously produce new leadership. In Colombia, the problems are many times worse. Again, Colombia is more than 50 times larger than El Salvador, with 9 times the population. This population is spread across some of Latin America's most challenging terrain, combining impenetrable jungles, high mountain ranges, and thousands of kilometers of coastline and river systems that have served as trafficking corridors for decades. Second, the armed groups within Colombia are far more complex than those in El Salvador. For one thing, they are not solely reliant on extortion to finance their operations. The Gulf Clan, Colombia's largest criminal organization, generates revenue by taxing coca cultivation and controlling the routes through which the finished product reaches Central America, the US, and Europe. The Gulf Clan is also involved in illegal mining and human smuggling. The National Liberation Army, or ELN, finances itself through a combination of drug trafficking, illegal gold mining, kidnapping, and extortion. Dissident factions of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as FARC, splintered into self-contained paramilitary groups several years ago, following the disarmament of the main FARC organization under the same national amnesty plan that Colombians now largely regard as a failure. These splinter paramilitary groups rely on drug trafficking, extortion, illegal mining, and in some areas kidnapping and control of coca economies. De la Espriella will need to disrupt these diverse income streams if he is to end the violence. But that is vastly more difficult in Colombia than it was for El Salvador, where Bukele primarily had to dismantle an extortion racket. De la Espriella cannot simply chip away at these income streams one by one. These groups are too diversified, and even if they have to tighten their purse strings for a while, they will be able to survive by relying on other parts of their illicit businesses. There is also the risk that if De la Espriella goes after gang leaders, these groups will fracture even further, as they did in Ecuador, creating an even bigger crisis. It is also crucial to remember that Colombia has tried the military path before, with mixed results. From 2002 to 2010, during the presidency of Álvaro Uribe, Colombia conducted a sustained military offensive against FARC, then the country's largest insurgent group. At that time, Bogotá was backed by billions of dollars in U.S. assistance through Plan Colombia. FARC was weakened and pushed out of some controlled territory, but it adapted. It shifted to guerrilla warfare tactics, deepened its involvement in drug trafficking and alternative revenue streams, and aggressively recruited among the rural population. Eventually, FARC signed a peace deal with the government. However, internal factions resisted the peace process and became the active dissident groups we mentioned earlier. More importantly, even if FARC laid down its arms, it was the only group to do so. Colombia still harbored numerous other armed groups, more than willing to move into the vacuum left behind. We are not suggesting that De la Espriella's total war is doomed to fail. Instead, we are cautioning that Colombia is fundamentally different from El Salvador, and what worked in the latter might not work in the former, at least not without considerable changes. But De la Espriella is not yet the president of Colombia. Although all signs suggest he will win, voters still have to choose between his total war plan and the alternative, total peace. The alternative, total peace, is an ideology deeply linked with current President Gustavo Petro, the nation's first ever leftist president and its 35th president. The basic premise of total peace was to offer the country's armed groups a package of incentives, including the chance to retain part of their wealth, the suspension of military operations against them, and reduced sentences. In exchange, they would disarm and return to the legal economy. Total peace was already underway before Petro was elected, but after taking office, he announced a 6-month ceasefire with the 5 largest armed groups. While the ceasefire was a good idea in theory, most security experts believed it was hastily conceived. One expert told the conflict monitoring group Indepaz it had no protocols, oversight mechanisms, or territorial demarcation of where the armed groups should remain in the meantime. The ELN immediately denied it had agreed to any ceasefire, and the government suspended its ceasefires with 2 other groups within months because they had violated the agreement's terms. This pattern held for the next 3 years. Deals announced, violated, suspended, and resumed, with the groups growing steadily stronger throughout. In a way, it was similar to El Salvador's pre-crackdown period, except in Colombia, the decisive crackdowns never came. By the time Colombia reached election season, total peace was widely regarded as a failure. In one poll, 52% of respondents said the initiative was not viable, and 68% said the security situation was deteriorating. A key reason for this is that armed groups had grown their numbers from 6,500 in 2017 to at least 25,000 by 2025, and the homicide rate remained staggeringly high at 25, 8 per 100,000 in 2025. The man asking Colombia to try again is Senator Iván Cepeda, a longtime ally of President Petro and widely seen as the architect of total peace. Cepeda is one of the more tragic figures in Colombian politics. His father, a journalist and Secretary General of the Colombian Communist Party, was assassinated by paramilitaries with links to the Colombian state. That makes Iván Cepeda one of the most high-profile victims of the violence Colombia has endured throughout modern history. Despite this early encounter with violence, Cepeda continues to be a staunch believer in total peace. In an interview with El Tiempo, he argued that total peace was not responsible for the strengthening of armed groups or for the increasing violence in regions like Cauca. He blames the growth of these groups on Colombia's illicit economy and the lack of solutions and resources in impoverished areas. To that end, he has stated he would expand the welfare state. strengthen programs like subsidies for senior citizens, and build new universities to give young Colombians a chance to acquire meaningful skills. He also said he would assess how and with which groups he conducts dialogue, adding that Colombia could not be locked in eternal dialogue with armed groups without achieving results. Despite these promises, skepticism remains regarding the effectiveness of another 4 years of total peace. The past 4 years have seen gangs grow in number, while homicide rates remain consistently high and state security capacity deteriorates further. Still, despite our skepticism, we will not be voting in Colombia's runoff election, scheduled for June 21, 2024. The Colombian people will have to decide whether their country follows the path of total peace or total war, in a runoff where candidates who might have offered a middle ground have already been voted out of the contest.